The morning of September 17, 2006, started like any other Sunday at Mount Zion Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. The parking lot was slowly filling with cars as congregation members arrived for the 10 o'clock service. However, something was terribly wrong. The usual sound of gospel music flowing from the sanctuary was absent, replaced by an unsettling silence that seemed to echo through the red brick building. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel by clicking the icon in the bottom right corner of your screen. Now let's get into the story. Pastor David Coleman stood at the front entrance, greeting his parishioners with his characteristic warm smile, but his eyes betrayed growing concern. It was 9:45 and there was still no sign of the worship team. Marcus Washington, the 28-year-old worship leader known for his powerful voice and unwavering dedication, was never late. Neither were Keisha Thompson, the 24-year-old lead vocalist whose angelic voice could move the entire congregation to tears. Damon Rivers, the 31-year-old drummer who had been with the church for over a decade. Or Shanice Mitchell, the 26-year-old keyboardist whose musical arrangements had become the heart of their Sunday services. Mrs. Eleanor Banks, a church elder who had been attending Mount Zion for 30 years, approached Pastor Coleman with visible worry etched on her face. She had tried calling Marcus 3 times, but each call went straight to voicemail. The same happened when she called the others. It was as if they had all simply vanished into thin air. The worship team had been scheduled to arrive at 8:30 that morning for their final rehearsal before the service. They had been preparing for weeks for this particular Sunday, as it marked the church's annual homecoming celebration. The sanctuary was decorated with beautiful floral arrangements, and families from across the state had traveled to Birmingham to be part of this special day. As the clock approached 10, Pastor Coleman made the difficult decision to begin the service without the worship team. Sister Mary Johnson, the church pianist for over 20 years, stepped in to provide musical accompaniment. The congregation sang familiar hymns, but the energy that usually filled the sanctuary was noticeably absent. Everyone could feel that something was wrong. After the service, a group of concerned church members, led by Deacon James Patterson and Mrs. Banks, decided to drive to the homes of each missing worship team member. What they discovered sent chills down their spines. All 4 cars were missing from their respective driveways, and none of the neighbors had seen them leave that morning. Marcus lived in a modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street, just 10 minutes from the church. His elderly neighbor, Mrs. Rosa Williams, mentioned that she had heard Marcus practicing his guitar on the front porch the evening before, as he often did on Saturday nights, but she hadn't seen him leave that morning, which was unusual because Marcus always waved goodbye when he left for church. Keisha's apartment complex was their next stop. The manager, Mr. Tony Richards, confirmed that her car was not in its assigned parking space, but he couldn't recall seeing her leave. Keisha was known for her punctuality and had never missed a church service in the 3 years she had been part of the worship team. The pattern continued at Damon's house and Shanice's apartment. Both vehicles were gone, but no one had witnessed their departure. It was as if all 4 had simply disappeared simultaneously, leaving no trace behind. By Sunday evening, Pastor Coleman knew he had to contact the authorities. The Birmingham Police Department initially treated it as a missing persons case, but the circumstances were unusual enough to warrant immediate attention. Detective Robert Hayes, a veteran investigator with 15 years of experience, was assigned to the case. Detective Hayes began his investigation by interviewing family members and close friends of the missing worship team. What emerged was a picture of 4 dedicated individuals who lived their lives centered around their faith and their commitment to the church. None of them had any known enemies, financial troubles, or personal issues that might explain their sudden disappearance. Marcus had been the worship leader for 5 years and was beloved by the entire congregation. He worked as a music teacher at a local elementary school and had recently become engaged to his longtime girlfriend, Angela Moore. They had been planning their wedding for the following spring, and Marcus had been excitedly discussing the details with fellow church members just days before his disappearance. Kaisha worked as a nurse at Birmingham General Hospital and was known for her compassionate nature both at work and in the church community. She had no romantic entanglements and lived a quiet, faith-centered life. Her parents, who lived in Atlanta, were devastated when they received the news of her disappearance. Damon was a family man with 2 young children and a wife who worked as a schoolteacher. He had been the church drummer for over 10 years and was considered one of the most reliable members of the congregation. His wife, Patricia, told Detective Hayes that Damon had seemed perfectly normal on Saturday night and had even helped their children with their homework before going to bed early in preparation for Sunday's service. Shanice was the youngest member of the group, but was equally committed to her faith and music. She worked part-time at a local music store while studying music education at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. Her professors and classmates described her as focused and responsible, making her sudden disappearance all the more puzzling. As the first week passed without any leads, the case began to attract media attention. Local news stations covered the story, and the church community rallied together to organize search parties. Volunteers combed through nearby parks, forests, and abandoned buildings, hoping to find any clue that might lead to the missing worship team. The investigation revealed that all 4 had been active on social media and in text communications up until Saturday night. Marcus had posted a Bible verse on his social media account around 10 p.m. on Saturday, expressing his excitement about leading worship the next morning. Kaisha had sent a goodnight text to her mother around the same time. There was no indication that any of them were planning to leave town or had any concerns about their safety. Detective Hayes expanded the investigation to include possible scenarios, ranging from abduction to voluntary disappearance, though the latter seemed highly unlikely given the characters and circumstances of the missing individuals. The fact that all 4 had disappeared simultaneously suggested either a coordinated effort by outside parties or some kind of planned group departure, which seemed inconsistent with everything known about their personalities and commitments. As Chapter 1 of this mysterious case closes, the Mount Zion Baptist Church community was left grappling with questions that seemed to have no answers. 4 beloved members of their spiritual family had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a silence that would haunt the congregation for years to come. Chapter 2. The investigation deepens. 2 weeks had passed since the disappearance of the Mount Zion Baptist Church worship team, and Detective Robert Hayes found himself facing one of the most perplexing cases of his career. The initial search efforts had yielded no results, and the investigation was beginning to take on a more serious tone as federal authorities considered the possibility of kidnapping across state lines. The FBI assigned Special Agent Lisa Crawford to work alongside Detective Hayes. Agent Crawford brought with her years of experience in missing persons cases and a methodical approach that complemented Hayes' local knowledge and community connections. Together, they began to dig deeper into the lives of Marcus Washington, Kaisha Thompson, Damon Rivers, and Shanice Mitchell. Their investigation revealed that the worship team had been receiving some unusual attention in the weeks leading up to their disappearance. Mount Zion Baptist Church had recently been featured in a local gospel music magazine for their outstanding musical ministry. The article had highlighted the exceptional talent of their worship team and mentioned that they had been considering recording an album to share their music with a broader audience. Pastor Coleman informed the investigators that the church had received several phone calls from people claiming to be music producers interested in working with the worship team. Most of these calls had been dismissed as either scams or well-meaning but unrealistic offers. However, one particular caller had been more persistent than the others. A man identifying himself as Robert Sterling from Nashville had called the church office multiple times during the month of August, expressing strong interest in meeting with the worship team. He claimed to represent a Christian music label that specialized in discovering and promoting African American gospel artists. Pastor Coleman had been cautious about the offer, as the caller seemed evasive when asked for specific details about his company and credentials. The church secretary, Mrs. Dorothy Washington, Marcus's aunt, remembered that Mr. Sterling had been particularly interested in scheduling a meeting with the worship team on a Sunday morning. She had found this request odd, as most legitimate business meetings would be scheduled during weekday business hours. When Pastor Coleman declined to interrupt the worship team's ministry responsibilities, the calls had stopped abruptly in early September. Agent Crawford worked with telephone company records to trace the calls from Robert Sterling. The investigation revealed that the calls had originated from several different prepaid cell phones, making it impossible to establish a definitive identity or location for the caller. This discovery raised significant red flags and suggested that the worship team's disappearance might not have been as random as initially thought. Meanwhile, Detective Hayes focused on the physical evidence from the morning of the disappearance. The church's security camera system was limited, with only one camera covering the main entrance and another monitoring the church office area. Neither camera provided a view of the parking lot where the worship team would typically park their vehicles. However, the camera footage did reveal something interesting. At approximately 7:15 on the morning of September 17th, an unfamiliar white van had been captured briefly in the background of the main entrance camera view. The van appeared to be parked at the far end of the church parking lot, in an area that was not well lit and partially obscured by large oak trees. The technical team enhanced the footage, but the van was too far away and the image quality too poor to make out license plate numbers or other identifying details. What they could determine was that the van remained in the parking lot for approximately 45 minutes, leaving sometime around 8 o'clock, just before the worship team would have typically arrived for their morning rehearsal. Church members were questioned about the white van, but no one recalled seeing it before or could provide any additional information about its occupants. The timing of the van's presence, however, was too coincidental to ignore, and it became a central focus of the investigation. As the investigators delved deeper into the background of each missing person, they discovered that Marcus Washington had mentioned to several friends that he had been feeling watched in the days leading up to his disappearance. Initially, church members had attributed this to pre-wedding jitters, as Marcus was known to be a somewhat anxious person by nature. However, in light of the current circumstances, these comments took on a more sinister significance. Marcus's fiancée, Angela Moore, provided investigators with additional details that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now appeared potentially relevant. She recalled that Marcus had mentioned seeing the same car parked near his house on multiple occasions during the week before his disappearance. The car was described as a dark-colored sedan with tinted windows, and Marcus had noticed it because it seemed out of place in his quiet neighborhood. Angela had encouraged Marcus to report his concerns to the police, but he had dismissed her worries, saying he was probably just being paranoid due to the stress of wedding planning and his increased responsibilities at church. Now Angela deeply regretted not insisting that Marcus take his concerns more seriously. The investigation also revealed that Keisha Thompson had mentioned to her nursing colleagues at Birmingham General Hospital that she had received several hang-up calls at her apartment during the week before her disappearance. When she answered the phone, the caller would remain silent for several seconds before disconnecting. Keisha had assumed these were prank calls or wrong numbers, but the frequency and timing now seemed suspicious. Dr. Michael Stevens, the head of nursing at the hospital, remembered that Keisha had seemed more reserved than usual during her final week of work. She had mentioned to him that she was considering changing her phone number due to the nuisance calls, but she had wanted to wait until after the church's homecoming celebration to avoid any disruption to the worship team's preparations. Damon Rivers' wife, Patricia, provided perhaps the most significant piece of information when she remembered that Damon had received an unusual letter in the mail about 10 days before his disappearance. The letter had no return address and contained what appeared to be a religious tract about the importance of using one's musical talents to serve God. Patricia had thought it was strange because the tract specifically mentioned drums and percussion instruments, which seemed too coincidental given Damon's role in the church. Unfortunately, Patricia had thrown the letter away, thinking it was just religious spam mail. However, she was able to provide a detailed description of the track's content and appearance. Agent Crawford made notes to check with local printing companies and religious organizations to see if they could identify the source of the material. Shanice Mitchell's roommate, Jennifer Lewis, revealed that Shanice had been excited about a potential opportunity to audition for a Christian music group based in Atlanta. She had received information about the audition through an email that claimed to be from a talent scout who had seen the magazine article about Mount Zion's worship team. The email had requested that Shanice keep the audition opportunity confidential until it was confirmed, which is why she hadn't mentioned it to other members of the worship team. Jennifer provided investigators with access to Shanice's email account, but the message from the alleged talent scout had been deleted. The technical team was able to recover fragments of the email, which revealed that it had been sent from a free email service using an obviously fake name. The email had included instructions for Shanice to meet at a location in Birmingham early Sunday morning for a preliminary audition before traveling to Atlanta later that day. As Chapter 2 of this investigation concluded, a pattern was beginning to emerge. It appeared that each member of the worship team had been individually targeted and manipulated in the weeks leading up to their disappearance. The perpetrator or perpetrators had clearly done their research, using personal information and the worship team's passion for their ministry to lure them into a trap. The white van, the mysterious phone calls, the unusual mail, and the fake audition opportunity all pointed to a carefully orchestrated plan. But who was behind it, and what had happened to Marcus, Keisha, Damon, and Shanice? As the investigation moved into its third week, Detective Hayes and Agent Crawford knew they were racing against time to find answers before the trail went completely cold. Chapter 3: Secrets in the Sanctuary. As autumn settled over Birmingham in 2006, the Mount Zion Baptist Church community struggled to maintain their faith and hope while grappling with the continued absence of their beloved worship team. It had been 6 weeks since Marcus Washington, Keisha Thompson, Damon Rivers, and Shanice Mitchell had vanished, and the investigation had hit several dead ends despite the emerging pattern of targeted manipulation. Detective Hayes and Agent Crawford decided to expand their investigation beyond the immediate circumstances of the disappearance. They began examining the church's history, membership records, and any potential connections to other similar cases across the southeastern United States. What they discovered would add new layers of complexity to an already puzzling case. Mount Zion Baptist Church had been established in 1952 and had grown from a small congregation of 30 families to over 400 active members by 2006. The church had weathered various challenges throughout its history, including financial difficulties in the 1980s and a leadership transition in the late 1990s when the previous pastor had retired after 25 years of service. Pastor David Coleman had been called to lead Mount Zion in 1999, bringing with him a vision for expanding the church's musical ministry and community outreach programs. Under his leadership, the worship team had flourished, attracting talented musicians from throughout the Birmingham area. The missing worship team had been his pride and joy, representing the culmination of his efforts to create a vibrant, spiritually powerful musical ministry. However, the investigators discovered that not everyone in the church had been supportive of Pastor Coleman's emphasis on contemporary gospel music and the prominence he had given to the worship team. A small but vocal group of long-time members had preferred the traditional hymns and more conservative worship style that had characterized the church for decades. Deacon Harold Thompson, Keisha's uncle and a member of Mount Zion for over 30 years, had been one of the most vocal critics of the new direction. He had argued in church board meetings that the contemporary music was too worldly and that the worship team was receiving too much attention and praise from the congregation. Some members recalled heated discussions between Deacon Thompson and Pastor Coleman about the appropriate role of music in worship. When investigators interviewed Deacon Thompson, they found him to be bitter and resentful about the changes in the church, but he had a solid alibi for the morning of September 17th. He had been attending a deacons' conference in Montgomery, Alabama, with several other church leaders, and there were multiple witnesses to confirm his presence there throughout the weekend. However, Deacon Thompson's interviews revealed another potential lead. He mentioned that his concerns about the worship team had been shared by several other people in the community, including some individuals who were not members of Mount Zion, but had expressed strong opinions about contemporary gospel music and its influence on traditional church worship. One name that came up repeatedly in these conversations was Vernon Mitchell, no relation to Shanice despite sharing the same surname. Vernon was a former member of Mount Zion who had left the church in 2003 after a disagreement with Pastor Coleman over the direction of the music ministry. He had started attending a more conservative Baptist church across town, but had continued to harbor resentment toward Mount Zion and its worship team. Agent Crawford and Detective Hayes located Vernon Mitchell working as a maintenance supervisor at a large manufacturing plant in nearby Bessemer, Alabama. When they interviewed him at his workplace, Mitchell made no attempt to hide his disdain for contemporary gospel music and his belief that it was corrupting traditional Christian worship. Mitchell claimed that churches like Mount Zion were more concerned with entertaining people than with genuine spiritual worship. He specifically criticized the missing worship team, saying they had been more focused on gaining recognition and possibly pursuing secular music careers than on serving God with humility and reverence. However, when pressed for details about his whereabouts on September 17th, Mitchell provided a verifiable alibi. He had been working a double shift at the plant that weekend, covering for a coworker who was sick. Security cameras and time clock records confirmed his presence at work from Saturday evening through Sunday afternoon. The investigation into church dynamics revealed another interesting connection. Several members mentioned that the worship team had been approached by representatives from other churches who were interested in having them perform at special events. Most of these requests had been legitimate and had been handled through proper channels with Pastor Coleman's approval. However, Mrs. Dorothy Washington, the church secretary, remembered one particular inquiry that had seemed unusual. In late August, a woman claiming to represent a network of Baptist churches in Tennessee had called to inquire about booking the worship team for a regional gospel music festival. The woman had been very knowledgeable about the team's music and had seemed legitimate, but she had been pushy about scheduling a meeting and had wanted to meet with the team members individually rather than going through the church's normal booking procedures. When Mrs. Washington had requested more information about the festival and the churches involved, the woman had promised to send materials, but had never followed through. The woman had called herself Sarah Phillips and had claimed to be based in Nashville, but subsequent efforts to contact her had been unsuccessful. Agent Crawford worked with Tennessee authorities to investigate any connections to the Robert Sterling persona, who had called earlier about music production opportunities. The similarities in the approach and the Nashville connection suggested that the same individual or group might have been behind both contacts. Meanwhile, Detective Hayes focused on the technical aspects of the case. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit had provided a profile suggesting that the disappearance was likely the work of someone with intimate knowledge of the church, its members, and their routines. The level of planning and coordination required suggested either a single individual with significant resources and patience, or a small group working together. The profile indicated that the perpetrator was likely motivated by ideological opposition to contemporary gospel music, personal resentment toward the church or its leadership, or possibly financial gain through human trafficking or other criminal activities. The careful targeting of each worship team member and the manipulation tactics used suggested someone with above-average intelligence and planning abilities. As investigators dug deeper into the church's financial records, they discovered that Mount Zion had recently received a significant donation that was specifically designated for expanding the music ministry. The donation had come from an anonymous donor through a legal firm in Atlanta, and the church had used the funds to purchase new sound equipment and instruments for the worship team. Pastor Coleman explained that the donation had been a tremendous blessing, allowing the church to upgrade their musical capabilities significantly. The worship team had been particularly excited about the new equipment and had been planning to use it for the first time during the homecoming celebration on September 17th. The timing of the donation, just 2 months before the disappearance, raised questions about potential connections. Agent Crawford contacted the Atlanta law firm that had facilitated the donation, but attorney-client privilege prevented them from revealing the identity of the donor without a court order. As Chapter 3 of this investigation concluded, the case had become even more complex. The investigators had identified several potential motives and persons of interest, but solid evidence remained elusive. The pattern of manipulation and the careful planning involved suggested that this was not a random crime, but rather a calculated act by someone with specific knowledge and strong motivations. The church community continued to pray for the safe return of their missing worship team, but as the weeks turned into months, hope was beginning to fade. Pastor Coleman struggled to maintain his own faith while providing comfort and leadership to his grieving congregation. The empty spaces where Marcus, Kaisha, Damon, and Shanice had once stood during worship services served as a constant reminder of the mystery that continued to haunt Mount Zion Baptist Church. Chapter 4: The Long Wait and New Discoveries. The years that followed the disappearance of the Mount Zion Baptist Church worship team were marked by a gradual shift from active investigation to cold case status. By 2008, Detective Hayes had retired from the Birmingham Police Department, and Agent Crawford had been reassigned to other cases. The file remained open, but with no new leads or evidence, the investigation had essentially stalled. Pastor David Coleman had made the difficult decision to rebuild the worship ministry, knowing that the church needed to move forward while never forgetting their missing members. New musicians joined the team, but the sanctuary was never quite the same. A memorial plaque was installed near the piano, honoring Marcus Washington, Kaisha Thompson, Damon Rivers, and Shanice Mitchell, and their photographs remained displayed in the church lobby. The families of the missing worship team members struggled to find closure. Marcus's fiancée, Angela Moore, eventually moved to Atlanta to be closer to her family, though she maintained contact with the Mount Zion community. Damon's wife, Patricia, raised their 2 children as a single mother, always hoping that their father would somehow return home. The children, who had been only 6 and 8 years old when their father disappeared, grew up with only faded memories of the man who had taught them to play simple rhythms on his drum kit. Kaisha's parents in Atlanta never stopped believing that their daughter was still alive somewhere, perhaps being held against her will. They hired private investigators and maintained a website dedicated to finding her. Posting regular updates and pleas for information. Shanice's family held memorial services on each anniversary of her disappearance, treating it as both a remembrance and a continued call for answers. The broader Birmingham community had largely moved on from the story, though it occasionally resurfaced in local media on significant anniversaries. The case had generated several conspiracy theories over the years, ranging from human trafficking to witness protection programs to religious cult involvement. None of these theories had been substantiated with credible evidence, but they persisted in online forums and local gossip. In 2012, the case received renewed attention when a similar incident occurred in Memphis, Tennessee. 4 members of a gospel choir from a Methodist church disappeared after their Wednesday evening practice. The Memphis Police Department contacted Birmingham authorities to compare notes, but the circumstances were different enough that investigators concluded the cases were likely unrelated. The Memphis choir members were eventually found safe in a hospital in Little Rock, Arkansas, after their van had been involved in an accident and they had suffered temporary amnesia from their injuries. Detective Sarah Martinez, who had taken over Hayes' caseload, occasionally reviewed the Mount Zion file when she had time between active cases. She had attended a few cold case conferences where she presented the details to other investigators, hoping that someone might recognize a pattern or have information about similar cases. These efforts had not yielded any breakthrough, but they kept the case in circulation within law enforcement circles. The investigation had explored numerous theories over the years. The human trafficking angle had been thoroughly investigated, with federal authorities examining connections to known trafficking networks throughout the Southeast. While they found evidence of trafficking activities in the Birmingham area, none of the known operators fit the profile or had any apparent connection to Mount Zion Baptist Church. The possibility that the worship team had voluntarily disappeared together had been considered, but was deemed highly unlikely given their individual circumstances and commitments. Marcus had been weeks away from his wedding. Damon had young children who adored him, and both Kaisha and Shanice had been deeply committed to their careers and education. There was no evidence of financial problems, romantic entanglements, or other personal issues that might have motivated them to start new lives elsewhere. The ideological motivation theory had also been extensively investigated. Authorities had examined several extremist groups that opposed contemporary Christian music or had expressed hostility toward African American churches. While some individuals had been identified as persons of interest, none had been connected to the Mount Zion case through credible evidence or witness testimony. As 2015 approached, marking the 9th anniversary of the disappearance, Pastor Coleman announced that Mount Zion would be undertaking a major renovation project. The church had grown significantly over the years, and the building needed updates to accommodate the larger congregation. The renovation would include expanding the sanctuary, updating the sound system, and improving the parking facilities. The parking lot renovation was scheduled to begin in early 2015, with plans to expand the existing asphalt area and add proper drainage systems. The church had hired Coleman Construction Company, a local firm owned by Pastor Coleman's cousin, Thomas Coleman, to manage the project. Thomas had been a member of Mount Zion for over 15 years and had volunteered his services at a significantly reduced rate as his contribution to the church's ministry. On March 15, 2015, the construction crew began the preliminary work of removing the old asphalt and surveying the existing drainage systems. The parking lot had been laid in sections over the years as the church had grown, and some areas were in better condition than others. The crew planned to completely redo the western section of the lot, which had been the most problematic in terms of drainage and surface quality. It was Thomas Coleman himself who made the discovery that would reignite the 9-year-old investigation. While operating a small excavator to remove damaged asphalt near the far end of the parking lot, close to where the mysterious white van had been spotted in 2006, his equipment struck something hard buried about 3 feet below the surface. Initially, Thomas assumed he had hit a water pipe or electrical conduit, but when he carefully excavated around the object, he discovered what appeared to be a cloth bag containing some kind of equipment. The bag was dirty and deteriorated from years underground, but it was clear that someone had deliberately buried it. Thomas immediately stopped work and called Pastor Coleman, who arrived at the construction site within minutes. When they carefully opened the bag, they found a wireless microphone system, the type commonly used by worship teams and other musical performers. The microphone itself was a high-quality model that would have been expensive when new, and despite its years underground, the serial numbers were still visible. Pastor Coleman recognized the microphone immediately. It was the same model and brand that the missing worship team had used, and it appeared to be one of the microphones that had disappeared along with Marcus, Kaisha, Damon, and Shanice 9 years earlier. The discovery sent shockwaves through the church community and immediately brought the cold case back to active status. Detective Martinez was called to the scene, and within hours, the parking lot had been designated as a potential crime scene. The microphone and bag were carefully preserved as evidence, and the excavation was halted while forensic specialists examined the area. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in to scan the surrounding area for any other buried objects or evidence. The discovery of the microphone raised more questions than it answered. How had it gotten buried in the church parking lot? Who had put it there, and when? Was it connected to the disappearance of the worship team, or was it simply equipment that had been discarded or lost over the years? The serial number on the microphone was traced back to the original purchase, confirming that it had indeed belonged to Mount Zion Baptist Church and had been part of the equipment used by the missing worship team. This confirmation meant that the microphone had definitely been at the church on the morning of September 17, 2006, when the worship team disappeared. As Chapter 4 concluded, the Mount Zion Baptist Church community found themselves once again thrust into the spotlight of a mystery that had never been solved. The buried microphone was physical evidence that something significant had happened at their church 9 years earlier, but it also represented a painful reminder of the 4 beloved members of their congregation who had never returned home. The renovation project was indefinitely postponed as investigators prepared to conduct the most thorough search of the church property since the original disappearance. After 9 years of questions without answers, there was finally a tangible clue that might lead to the truth about what had happened to Marcus Washington, Taisha Thompson, Damon Rivers, and Shanice Mitchell. Chapter 5: The Truth Unveiled. The discovery of the buried microphone transformed the cold case investigation into one of the most intensive police operations Birmingham had seen in years. Within 48 hours of Thomas Coleman's find, the Mount Zion Baptist Church parking lot had been cordoned off and declared an active crime scene. Detective Sarah Martinez coordinated with federal authorities, forensic specialists, and cold case experts from across the Southeast. The ground-penetrating radar revealed several anomalies beneath the church parking lot, leading to a systematic excavation that would continue for weeks. The church community watched in a mixture of hope and dread as investigators methodically searched the property where they had worshipped for decades. Dr. Rebecca Foster, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Alabama, was brought in to supervise the excavation process. Her team used archaeological techniques to carefully document each layer of soil and any artifacts discovered. The process was painstakingly slow, but it was essential to preserve any evidence that might finally solve the 9-year-old mystery. On March 22, 2015, exactly 1 week after the microphone discovery, the excavation team made a heartbreaking discovery. Approximately 15 feet from where the microphone had been buried, they uncovered human remains. The discovery sent shockwaves through the Birmingham community and brought national media attention to the small Baptist church. Over the following days, the remains of 4 individuals were carefully recovered from what appeared to be a hastily constructed grave. The state medical examiner, Dr. James Patterson, worked closely with Dr. Foster to document every aspect of the recovery. Dental records and DNA analysis would be needed to confirm the identities, but the location and circumstances strongly suggested that the missing worship team had finally been found. The investigation revealed evidence of blunt force trauma to the skulls of all 4 victims, indicating that they had been murdered rather than dying from natural causes or accidents. The positioning of the remains and the presence of the microphone suggested that the crimes had been committed at or near the church, possibly in the parking lot itself. As forensic analysis continued, Detective Martinez and her team focused on reconstructing the events of September 17, 2006. The evidence suggested that the worship team had arrived at the church for their morning rehearsal as planned, but they had encountered their killer or killers in the parking lot before they could enter the building. The investigation into the mysterious white van seen on security footage 9 years earlier took on new significance. Investigators now believed that the van had been used to transport equipment and possibly additional perpetrators to the church. The timing of the van's departure, around 8 o'clock in the morning, aligned with the estimated time of the murders based on the forensic evidence. A breakthrough came when investigators re-examined evidence from the original investigation with new technology available. In 2015, the fragmentary email recovered from Shanice Mitchell's account was subjected to advanced digital forensic analysis, revealing metadata that had not been accessible with 2006 technology. The email trail led investigators to a computer at a public library in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, about 60 miles from Birmingham. Security footage from the library, which had been archived but not previously examined, showed a man using the computer terminal during the time frame when the email was sent to Shanice. The man in the footage was identified as William Curtis Matthews, a 53-year-old former church musician who had been fired from several churches throughout Alabama and Tennessee for inappropriate behavior and conflicts with church leadership. Further investigation revealed that Matthews had harbored intense resentment toward contemporary gospel music and the musicians who performed it. Matthews had a history of mental health issues and had been hospitalized several times for psychiatric evaluation. He had written letters to local newspapers expressing his belief that contemporary Christian music was corrupting traditional worship and leading churches away from authentic faith. His letters had become increasingly hostile and concerning in the months leading up to the Mount Zion disappearance. The investigation revealed that Matthews had carefully researched the Mount Zion worship team, learning their schedules, personal information, and weaknesses. He had used multiple personas to contact each team member individually, manipulating them into believing they were being offered opportunities that aligned with their passions and goals. The plan had been to lure each team member to the church parking lot early on Sunday morning, before other church members arrived. Matthews had told Marcus he needed to meet with him about a special musical arrangement, convinced Kaisha that there was a medical emergency requiring her nursing skills, informed Damon that there was a problem with the drum equipment that needed immediate attention, and led Shanice to believe she was meeting a talent scout for her Atlanta audition. When all 4 team members arrived at the church that morning, they had found Matthews waiting for them with a weapon. The evidence suggested that he had intended to kidnap them and force them to renounce contemporary gospel music, but the situation had escalated beyond his control, resulting in their murders. Matthews had buried the bodies in the church parking lot, believing that the location would never be searched, and that he could continue to monitor investigation's progress through his continued involvement in the Birmingham church community. He had kept the microphone as some kind of twisted trophy, burying it separately as a symbol of his victory over what he saw as corrupted worship. The investigation team located Matthews living under an assumed name in a small town in rural Mississippi. When confronted with the evidence, he initially denied involvement, but eventually confessed to the murders when faced with overwhelming forensic proof. His confession revealed the depth of his mental illness and his obsession with what he perceived as the corruption of traditional Christian worship. Matthews explained that he had chosen the Mount Zion worship team because their success and recognition represented everything he believed was wrong with contemporary church music. He had convinced himself that he was acting on behalf of God to preserve the purity of Christian worship, a delusion that had driven him to commit these horrific crimes. The confession brought closure to the families of Marcus Washington, Kaisha Thompson, Damon Rivers, and Shanice Mitchell, though it could never truly heal the pain of their loss. The 4 worship team members were finally laid to rest in a joint memorial service that drew thousands of people from across Alabama and beyond. Pastor David Coleman delivered the eulogy, speaking about the faith and dedication that had characterized each of the 4 victims. He emphasized that their music and their ministry had touched countless lives and that their legacy would continue through the many people they had influenced during their time at Mount Zion Baptist Church. The church community chose to transform the location where the bodies had been discovered into a memorial garden, planting 4 trees to represent each of the worship team members. The memorial included a bronze plaque with their names and the Bible verse that Marcus had posted on social media the night before his death: "Make a joyful noise unto the Lord, all the lands." Psalm 100:1, William Curtis. Matthews was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the 4 murders. During his trial, mental health experts testified about his severe psychiatric conditions, but the jury determined that his actions had been premeditated and that he was legally responsible for his crimes. The case brought national attention to the issue of violence against religious communities and the importance of mental health resources. Many churches across the country implemented new security measures and protocols for protecting their members, particularly those involved in high-profile ministries. Detective Martinez, who had spent years working to solve the case, reflected on the importance of never giving up on cold cases. The advancement in forensic technology had made the difference in finally bringing justice to the victims and their families. She continued to work on other cold cases, using the lessons learned from the Mount Zion investigation. The Mount Zion Baptist Church slowly healed from the trauma of the tragedy. Pastor Coleman remained with the congregation for several more years before accepting a call to serve at another church. The new worship ministry that was established honored the memory of Marcus, Kaisha, Damon, and Shanice while moving forward with hope and faith. Angela Moore, Marcus's former fiancée, eventually married and started a family, but she never forgot the man who had been taken from her so brutally. She established a music scholarship in Marcus's name at the local college, ensuring that his passion for teaching and music would continue to impact future generations. Damon's children, now adults, had grown up knowing their father primarily through the stories shared by their mother and the Mount Zion community. They both became musicians themselves, carrying on their father's legacy of using music to worship and serve others. The case of the Mount Zion Baptist Church worship team became a study in both the depths of human evil and the power of community resilience. It demonstrated how mental illness, when combined with extremist beliefs and left untreated, could lead to tragic consequences for innocent people who were simply trying to serve God through their talents. The 9 years between the disappearance and the discovery of the truth had been a test of faith for the entire church community. Many had questioned how God could allow such evil to happen to people who were dedicating their lives to His service. But ultimately, the community found that their faith had been strengthened through the ordeal, and their commitment to using music as a form of worship had been deepened rather than diminished. The story of Marcus Washington, Kaisha Thompson, Damon Rivers, and Shanice Mitchell serves as a reminder of the preciousness of life and the importance of cherishing those who bring beauty and inspiration into our world. Their music may have been silenced too soon, but their impact on the Mount Zion Baptist Church community and beyond continues to resonate years after their tragic deaths. The buried microphone that led to the solution of their case became a symbol of how truth, no matter how deeply hidden, will eventually come to light. The Mount Zion community learned that even in the darkest circumstances, faith, perseverance, and the pursuit of justice can ultimately prevail. As this tragic chapter in the history of Mount Zion Baptist Church finally closed, the community chose to focus on the legacy of love, faith, and musical excellence that the 4 worship team members had left behind. Their story became a testament to the power of faith communities to support one another through unimaginable trials and to find hope even in the midst of profound loss.